Number 10. Janelle Garrick. While working as a sheriff's deputy in Jefferson County, Wisconsin in 2018, Janelle Garrick was busted for burglarizing the homes of grieving families while they were at their loved ones' funerals. According to authorities, she scoured local obituaries, researched each descendant's relatives, and found out where they lived. She then robbed their homes while they were saying their final goodbyes to their deceased relative. Garrick's crimes were creative and carefully planned, but they weren't foolproof. At least one of the home break-ins was captured on surveillance footage, and the crooked deputy eventually landed at the center of an investigation. She lost her job and was arrested and released on bond, but it apparently wasn't enough to deter her from continuing to burglarize people's homes. While her initial case was still pending, Garrick was caught stealing narcotic painkillers from a home outside Milwaukee. Detectives ultimately connected her to at least 6 robberies through fingerprints left behind on evidence at the scenes. The prosecutor asked the judge for a 1-year prison sentence, but in a rare move, he imposed a harsher 2-year sentence followed by 3 years of probation. Garrick blamed her actions on her opioid addiction and agreed that she deserved punishment, but said that she felt she needed more help than was being offered. Number 9. Craig Peyer. A few days after Christmas in 1986, 20-year-old college student Cara Knott left her boyfriend's house in Escondido, California, and headed to her parents' home in El Cajon. She never arrived at her destination. Her car was found on a dead-end street near Interstate 15 in San Diego County the next day, and her lifeless body was discovered at the bottom of a 65-foot, 19.8 meters ravine nearby. She had been beaten, strangled, and thrown off an abandoned bridge. 2 days after Cara's murder, a reporter interviewed 13-year California Highway Patrol veteran Craig Peyer about how to avoid falling victim to predators on the road. He had suspicious scratches on his face, which he claimed were from falling against a sharp fence. But when the segment aired, at least 24 women reported that Peyer had made inappropriate advances toward them in the past. Several callers claimed that Peyer had pulled them over on the same exit ramp where Cara was killed. The women said that Peyer wasn't violent toward them, but that he made unwelcome advances that made them feel uncomfortable. One witness told police that on the night of the murder, they saw Peyer roll into a gas station near the crime scene at a high rate of speed and in an obviously disheveled state. Others reported seeing Cara's car getting pulled over by a CHP vehicle on the night of her death. Inside Peyer's patrol car, investigators found forensic evidence connecting him to the murder scene. He was also linked to the crime through fibers found underneath Cara's fingernails. And while DNA technology was in its infancy, blood from the scene matched Peyer's blood type, which also happens to be the rarest blood type. Even his colleagues were willing to testify in court regarding his strange behavior on the night of Cara's murder, and a closer look into his past revealed that he had a suspicious tendency to pull over women who were driving alone at night. Peyer was charged with murder. His first trial ended in a hung jury, but the second trial ended with a conviction and a sentence of 25 years to life. He continues to maintain his innocence, but has refused to provide DNA in his efforts to clear his name, and has been denied parole 3 times. He'll be 77 years old when his next parole hearing rolls around in 2027. Number 8. Manuel Manny Pardo Jr. Manuel Manny Pardo Jr.'s law enforcement career began with the Florida Highway Patrol during the 1970s. By all outward appearances, he was a stand-up cop. He graduated from the police academy at the top of his class and saved a toddler's life during his first years on the job. But all was not as it seemed, and in 1979, Pardo was fired for falsifying traffic tickets. He soon found work as a police officer for the small city of Sweetwater in Miami-Dade County, where he stayed until 1985. Pardo lost his job after lying on the stand about being an international undercover agent in a criminal case. Shortly after being fired, the unemployed former cop got involved in drug smuggling. In early 1986, he fatally shot 2 men named Mario Amador and Roberto Alonso during a botched robbery. Less than a month later, one of his associates lured a man named Michael Millet to his wife's car. Pardo had previously bought gun silencers from Millet, but suspected that he was a police informant. When Millet got into the car, Pardo shot him in the head. The disgraced ex-police officer only continued to kill from there. In February 1986, just weeks after shooting Millet, he murdered Luis Robledo and Ulpiano Lido during a home invasion gone wrong. 2 months later, he killed 4 people in 2 separate incidents, one over a stolen property disagreement and another stemming from a victim's failure to show up at multiple planned drug deals. During Pardo's final double murder, he accidentally shot himself in the foot. Authorities apprehended him at a hospital in New York the following month. A search of his apartment turned up a disturbing trove of Nazi memorabilia. Pardo admitted to at least 6 out of the 9 murders he was accused of committing, but tried to make his actions seem noble by claiming that he killed with the goal of combating Florida's drug culture. During his trial, he said that he took pictures of his victims after the murders to capture their souls and then burned the pictures in a special ashtray. He claimed he was sane despite his attorney's attempt to plead insanity on his behalf. According to prosecutors, Pardo was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer and a drug dealer who killed as a way to eliminate his competition on the streets. He was convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. Pardo was executed in 2012 by lethal injection at the age of 56. Number 7. Wojciech Braszczok. While driving on the streets of Manhattan with his wife in 2013, Alexei and Leanne accidentally ran over a man on a motorcycle with his SUV. Around a dozen bikers immediately gave chase, making him too scared to stop at the scene. The gang surrounded Leanne on a highway exit and smashed up his vehicle, then pulled him out of the SUV and brutally beat him down. It would later come to light that one of the bikers was 34-year-old Wojciech Braszczok, an undercover NYPD detective. While Braszczok didn't participate in the assault against Leanne, he did help chase the motorist down, and he smashed the SUV's rear window before fleeing the scene. And he failed to dial 911 or summon any sort of help from law enforcement. Braszczok and the other bikers claimed that they were just trying to stop Leanne from fleeing the scene of an accident. The disgraced detective insisted that he never meant to hurt anyone and that he fled as soon as he saw the other bikers attacking the victim. In other words, it was apparently his way of showing that he disapproved, or at least wasn't involved in the attack. Footage of the encounter and other evidence showed that the gang went far beyond reasonable means of stopping someone from fleeing an accident scene, and several of the individuals involved were criminally charged in connection with the incident. The judge overseeing Braszczok's case described the violence as an act of revenge, pure and simple. He found Braszczok guilty of assault, riot, and several other charges at the end of a 3-week bench trial, which means that there was no jury and that the decision to convict was entirely up to the judge. Needless to say, Braszczok was also stripped of his badge. The prosecutor urged the judge to sentence Braszczok to 3.5 years in prison, although he could have faced a sentence of up to 7 years. Meanwhile, the defense implored the judge to let the defendant off with no prison time. He received a 2-year sentence and was admonished in court for his apparent lack of remorse and his blatant lack of professionalism. Number 6. Sidney Dorsey. Sidney Dorsey became DeKalb County, Georgia's first African-American sheriff in 1996 at the age of 56. 4 years later, in 2000, he lost his re-election bid to 46-year-old veteran officer Derwin Brown, who vowed to investigate allegations of corruption against Dorsey. Just weeks later, and 3 days before he was slated to begin his term as sheriff, Brown was shot dead outside his home. Suspicion immediately fell on Dorsey, who had allegedly told several acquaintances that Brown would never take office and that there would be a special election for sheriff soon. Investigators traced the shooting to Patrick Cuffey, a former employee of Dorsey's private security firm who took a job at the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department's Internal Affairs Division during Dorsey's tenure. Dorsey had recruited Cuffey to kill Brown, but Cuffey didn't want to carry out the hit alone, so Dorsey encouraged him to seek help from 3 other former employees of his security firm. Melvin Walker, David Ramsey, and Paul Skyers agreed to help Cuffey commit the murder in exchange for promotions and jobs that they wanted. Coffey and Skyers testified against Dorsey in exchange for immunity, and Walker and Ramsey were acquitted of murder. Dorsey maintained his innocence but was convicted of murder for masterminding the crime. He was sentenced to life for the murder charge and an additional 23 years for corruption charges stemming from his activities during his time as sheriff, which included using county funding and employees for personal expenses and errands. Dorsey reportedly admitted to ordering the hit in 2007, but claimed that he had second thoughts and tried to stop it from happening. Do you think Dorsey is less guilty than the men who carried out the hit, since he didn't actually pull the trigger? Or do you think he's just as guilty, or perhaps even more so, especially since the other defendants may not have committed the murder without his urging? Let us know in the comments below. Number 5. Drew Peterson. By the time Drew Peterson married his third wife, Kathleen Savio, in 1992, he had been working as a cop for the Bolingbrook, Illinois Police Department for 15 years. About a decade later, it became clear that he was heading toward his third divorce. Between 2002 and 2004, police were called to Peterson's home at least 18 times over domestic disputes. Not long after that, Kathleen was found dead in a dry bathtub with suspicious injuries. The case went before a coroner's jury, which included a personal friend of Peterson's who assured the other jurors that Peterson would never harm Kathleen. They ruled her death accidental, despite any evidence pointing to the contrary. Just 6 months later, 49-year-old Peterson married his fourth wife, 19-year-old Stacey Ann Cales. In 2007, 3 years into the marriage, Stacey's sister reported her missing. Peterson claimed that Stacey had left him for another man. Her body was never found, and she's still considered missing, but the case prompted authorities to exhume Kathleen's body and take a second look at her injuries. They reclassified her death as a homicide and charged Peterson with murder. While the autopsy results were never released to the public, prosecutors accused Peterson of attempting to stage Kathleen's death as an accident. He was convicted of the crime and received a 38-year sentence, but continues to maintain his innocence. In the meantime, the search for Stacey's remains continues. Drew Peterson is notorious for his cocky demeanor, which some might even describe as outwardly narcissistic. Number 4. Robert Carroll. During his career as an undercover police officer in Manchester, England, Robert Carroll took on an alternative identity as a drug dealer named Lee Taylor as part of an operation called Bluebeard. Its purpose was to crack down on real drug dealers, but he went to extreme lengths to make his false identity believable and got addicted to heroin. He would later claim that he got his first taste of the drug while carrying pockets of it in his mouth. Known as kitting, this got him accustomed to small amounts of heroin. Carroll also later alleged that he was exposed to the drug in other situations that his superiors were aware of. He left his undercover position in 2009 and went back to regular cop duties, but by then he was already addicted. 3 years later, in 2012, Carroll sought professional help for a problem that he realized he couldn't conquer on his own. But the addiction continued to control him, and he eventually got so hooked that he traded some of his police gear for heroin. Carroll got caught and was fired in 2013, and he was sentenced to 14 months in prison for theft and misconduct in public office. His actions may seem more desperate or like the unfortunate product of circumstance rather than deliberately criminal. And that's exactly what Carroll claimed in court when he sued the Greater Manchester Police in 2017. The disgraced ex-cop's former employer argued that he waited too long to file his claim, and they weren't wrong. He had exceeded the typical 3-year threshold for lodging a complaint in these types of cases. The police department also described Carroll's case as weak. But a panel of judges ultimately ruled that he had a right to at least have the evidence heard. In other words, they determined that Carroll could at least try to sue the department. And while it certainly wasn't a guaranteed win, it marked an unusual turning point in a situation where he normally would have been powerless. The outcome of the case is unclear. Number 3. Mikhail Popkov. Starting in 1992, Russian cop Mikhail Popkov murdered dozens of women in the city of Angarsk and elsewhere throughout the Irkutsk region. He targeted full-figured victims who resembled his abusive mother and gained their trust using his uniform and patrol car when he was actually off duty. Popkov offered rides to his victims, but instead of driving them to their destinations, he went to remote locations and viciously attacked them with various weapons, including knives, axes, baseball bats, and screwdrivers. His victims were often mutilated beyond recognition, earning the unidentified killer the nicknames of the Werewolf and the Angarsk Maniac. Authorities began investigating Popkov's crimes early on, but he managed to evade detection for the better part of 2 decades. Detectives eventually realized that the murders were probably being committed by a cop when they began discovering tire tracks at the crime scenes that matched a specific type of off-road vehicle used by law enforcement. They zeroed in on Popkov in 2012 after testing the DNA of 3,500 of the region's current and former police officers. During questioning, Popkov claimed he wanted to cleanse the streets of prostitutes. He also indicated that he believed his wife was unfaithful and that he was taking his rage over the suspected infidelity out on his victims. Popkov was convicted of 22 murders, although it's widely believed that he may have been responsible for more, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Number 2. Stephanie Lazarus. Sherry Rasmussen and John Rutan were only married for a few months before an unexpected tragedy brought their newlywed bliss to an abrupt end one afternoon in 1984. In what detectives initially classified as a burglary gone wrong, Sherry was found dead in the couple's home. Someone had beaten her and shot her 3 times in the chest at point-blank range. Unconvinced that his daughter was the victim of a botched robbery, Sherry's father, Nels, pushed detectives to investigate other possibilities. He claimed that his son-in-law's ex-girlfriend, a highly respected LAPD investigator named Stephanie Lazarus, had been harassing Sherry in the months leading up to her death. Investigators initially turned a blind eye to the lead, and the case went cold. As he fought an uphill battle to obtain justice for his daughter, Nels attempted to get some of the evidence DNA tested, and it conveniently turned up missing. The missing evidence was found in 2001, but Lazarus continued to fly under the radar until 2009, when a keen-eyed detective thoroughly reviewed the case file. DNA evidence tied Lazarus to the crime scene, and what started out as a normal workday for the art theft detective ended with her in custody as the prime suspect in Sherry's murder. During the trial, it was revealed that Lazarus and John Rutan had a casual relationship until John met Sherry. When Lazarus found out that her former lover planned to marry his new girlfriend, she evidently lost her mind and began wreaking havoc on the couple's lives. Prosecutors accused Lazarus of being enraged that she was nothing more than a fling to Rutan and that he saw Sherry as worthy of marrying. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life. Number 1. Antoinette Frank. Murder is not unusual in New Orleans, which carries one of the highest homicide rates in the United States. But one particularly brutal slaying rocked the city in 1995 when 23-year-old rookie officer Antoinette Frank and an accomplice, drug dealer Rogers Lacaze, opened fire on staff at a Vietnamese restaurant during the early morning hours. Frank had moonlighted at the Kim An restaurant as a security guard and knew that large amounts of cash were often kept on hand. Her colleague, Ronald Austin Williams II, was shot dead in the chaos while working at the restaurant as a security guard. 2 of the owner's family members, 17-year-old Quang Vu and his sister, 24-year-old Ha Vu, were also killed. Their sister, Chao Vu, and 2 other employees hid inside a walk-in cooler and survived. Chao later told the press that she saw Frank approaching the restaurant in uniform for the 3rd time that night and knew something was wrong, especially since she had lost her key to the front door. Frank had stolen the key during one of her earlier visits that night and used it to get inside during office hours. Unaware that there were surviving victims who had witnessed the crime, Frank fled the scene and returned a few minutes later as a responding officer, pretending she was there to help. The witnesses implicated her in the shooting, and she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She's currently the only woman on death row in Louisiana. By all appearances, Frank was an average cop who graduated near the top of her class at the police academy and was even recognized for her work in the community. But a closer look into her background revealed that she was caught lying on several parts of the job application and failed 2 standard pre-hire psychiatric evaluations. Experts advised against hiring her, but at the time, the department was desperate for new recruits to replace the officers it was losing to alleged criminal activity. Sadly, she continued the trend. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live in an area that's notorious for its corrupt police force, or in an extremely remote region where it's normal to wait up to an hour for law enforcement to reach the scene of a call? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.